Hello, everybody. Welcome from purgatory. I feel like I'm in exile here, apart from you. I miss you guys an awful lot. I wish I were there. I'm having a cookie in your honor here. Actually, I want to talk about night and some of the questions you did in the previous WA. Remember, WA 13 is due on Monday. So if you want to follow along, I suggest you go to Blackboard and go to night chronology, which I added. And if you want to pause this while you're finding that, you can. I was very impressed with all the answers to the WA that I received. I want to go over some of those things just by way of conversation, mini lecture, if you ever want to call what I do a lecture. But I'll do that today. And kind of using some of your answers as part of my lecture. So again, if you want to take a look at the night chronology, that's a good place to start. The very first question was relate chronologically, if possible, if I can talk, the systematic, methodical way the Nazis stripped Ellie of virtually everything. So by the end of his experience, here is a person, a young man, 15 years old, you can imagine that, who I think is left with virtually nothing. Everything has been taken from this individual, just about, both tangible and intangible. And if you look at the night chronology in the Blackboard, I kind of listed chronologically. I ask you to do that as well. And again, I took a lot of your answers when I included this, and then I added a few that maybe some of you missed. And I want to start with the fact that the book starts in 1941. So he makes mention by prologue of the year or two or three, really, before the Nazis actually overrun Siget, his hometown in Transylvania. And all of this, his narrative starts in 1941, 12 years old. And the thing I wanted to point out, and I have this outlined here, a lot of students don't catch this, and I think it's kind of important, is that he mentions 1943 as a year, and this is after, Moist the Beetle came back and warned them and told them of these horrific things that happened in the camps, and of course nobody believed him. Nobody could believe human beings could do that to other human beings. They thought he was crazy, but they did get the warnings. And of course, this is the 20th century. They didn't have internet then, they didn't have television then, but I mean, they had ways of communicating, and they heard rumors and they heard things that were going on in other parts of the world. And I think it's interesting that he mentions that 1943, a whole year passed without incident. It was actually in 1944 when things started to happen. The Nazis came to Siget and took it over. And if you know your history, the war with Germany ended in April of 1945. That's when he was liberated. So we're talking about, a year and a few months of real agony and terror for Ellie, where he was living. But 1943 passed without significant incident, and I think that's important because if you stop and think about it, this must have haunted him for years. And what I mean by that is they had a whole year after the warnings by Moist the Beetle and others to go somewhere else, to leave, to move to safety. They had a whole year passed without incident. And I think one of the themes of this book, and it is a narrative and it is a memoir, but I think also he included some literary elements in it as a writer would. And I think there are themes in this book, and one of the themes that runs through the story is missed opportunities. And I think this was the first one of a few in his narrative. Examples of that, missed opportunities. Oh, we all, I'm much older than you. I look back on my life. I have regrets. Maybe, I'm sure even as young as you guys are, there are times when you look back on your life and say, oh, you know what, I should have done this, or I should have done instead of that, or I wish I'd made a different decision, or I have certain regrets, certain things I said or certain things I did, I wish I'd never done. But in this case, these missed opportunities meant the difference between life and death. And that was the first one. I'm sure he must have thought about this many times, and I think this is one of the reasons why he mentioned it in the book. We could have left. We had a whole year. My family, my father could have left. Now, before we're too hard on his father and other men like him of that time who had that opportunity, to do that, you're asking them to pick up and move their family to God knows where and start all over. I'm sure his father was probably in his late 50s, 60s at least, an established person in the community. So it wouldn't have been easy to do that, but that's what they should have done. And Ellie must think about that all the time. A whole year. We had a whole year. And there are other stories of such there are other parts of the story that deal or show such missed opportunities. Yeah, if you remember the one evening when somebody raps on their window, and there was an opportunity to leave then, and if they had left that night, they could have been saved. Missed opportunity. Toward the end of the book, he and his father have a choice to either stay in the camp or go on the march. They choose to go on the march, and sadly enough, just in a couple of days, if they had stayed in the camp, they would have been liberated. But instead, they go on the march, and of course, that's when he loses his father. So missed opportunities is one of the running themes through the story, and I think that's, like I said, that's the reason why he doesn't just start the story with the Germans marching into Sighet and taking everything over. I think he wanted to give you a little bit of backstory, and I think he also wanted to introduce that theme of missed opportunities, regrets. Oh, I mean, if we'd only done this and not that. We had the chance, but we didn't take it. All right, as far as the things that are taken, if you look at the chronology, I've kind of listed them and highlighted them in yellow, and many of you listed a lot of these or most of these. Some of these are tangible things. Of course, one of the first things they did was, take possessions, take valuables. But notice in 1944, one of the first things they did was arrest the Jewish leaders in town, close the synagogues. So one of the first things they take away is the right to practice their religion. Of course, the reaction at that time to a lot of these early things was, well, I mean, if this is the worst they can do, if this is as bad as it's going to get, we can handle this. They're closing the synagogues, but I mean, we can practice our religion anywhere. We can pray anywhere. So there wasn't that much of an alarm when that happened. Then a curfew was imposed. Freedom of movement was then taken. This is an intangible thing. Just the freedom to get up and leave your house and take a walk was taken away, something like that. Then, of course, as I said, items of monetary worth, objects, possessions, valuables, wedding rings, things of that nature, diamonds, were among the first things taken. Now, of course, if you know a little bit of the history, or if you've seen other books, read other books, or seen other movies like Schindler's List, you'll know that a lot of Jews hid some of their other possessions and gave some away, but also hid some, thinking that eventually they would be able to retrieve those. And of course, in most cases, that wasn't true. Then I think we're getting into some of the more intangible but important things. Everybody was given a yellow star to wear, and they're actually being given something. But I always like to talk about in class, and again, I miss the discussion so much because you guys would be great with this. I hate to just say it, and I'd rather us talk about it. But what happens? What are you taking from someone when you make them wear a yellow star? And the obvious answer is you're taking any sense of their individuality, their personality. It's a way of saying we don't care if you're husband, a father, a wife, a mother. We don't care if you're a teacher, a doctor, a librarian. We don't care if you're a skilled musician. I always say in class, if I ask you to write down on a sheet of paper all the different ways that you could be classified as a person, I mean, all of us could list, 100 things and still keep going. But, and that these are all ways that we would like to be identified. But when you have to wear a yellow star, it's somebody telling you all we care about and all we worry about is the fact that you're a Jew. So any sense of individuality, uh, being prideful of other things. Certainly, they were proud of their religion, but they, like I said, all of us can be identified in any number of ways that we would like to be known for, not just the one thing. And of course, the Yellow Star made it easy then for Jews to be identified and persecuted. And of course, the great irony of this is, the propaganda made the Jews seem like they were somehow not even human beings. But of course, they were human beings and they look like any other human being. So you have to find some way to single them out and identify them easily, because just to look at somebody, you couldn't tell they were a Jew. So this was the very clever way the Germans figured this out. We'll just give everybody a yellow star to wear, and that's how we'll know who's who. Um, Eventually, homes were taken. They were forced into ghettos. So one of the first things, or later things, I should say, that they did was eventually they needed to concentrate the Jews in one place in the city. So they put them all in the ghetto. That would make it easier to transport them later on. You can't have them all scattered throughout the town. So eventually, people were taken out of their homes and transported to other homes in the area. But then they were concentrated there. And then I think, by that time, I think they realized just how serious the situation is. And of course, you have these terrifying, awful scenes of them, in many cases, taking miles and miles to walk to the nearest train station, where they were then crammed into cattle cars. And if you've ever seen Schindler's List, again, I really suggest you watch this movie. It's a great companion to this book. It shows a lot of the scenes that Wiesel talks about. And one of the questions I always ask, too, about this situation, and it just kind of shows how clever the Nazis were in their evilness, is when they did tell the Jews that they were going to be taking a march to somewhere else, they told them that they could take whatever possessions they thought that they could carry with them to wherever they were going. So they did that. And there's a very powerful scene in Schindler's List where you see these hundreds of Jews walking toward the train station, all carrying knapsacks and luggage and whatever they could carry. And then they finally hit the train station and they're told to drop all those things. And they're then crammed into cattle cars. And there's a very powerful scene in Schindler's List where you see the trains finally loaded up and they start to pull away, and then you see these mounds and mounds of human possessions just laying there in the station, ready to be picked up and carried over. And it's the mindset of the Nazis. I think they told the Jews that they could bring these things to give them a little bit of sense of self, a little bit of security and a false sense of security. And then, of course, by the time they get to the train station, they're surrounded, so there's nothing they can do. And of course, by that point, I think they realized just how serious the situation was. To go back to the chronology, well, I mean, hours upon hours cramped in a cattle car, one body up against another, you lose any sense of privacy, you lose any sense of dignity. Humanity is starting to be taken away from them. He mentions the powerful scene, Madame Schechter screaming out about fires, and of course, eventually they reach the camp and they see the fires. It's a very chilling scene. Um, I mentioned this the other day. Uh, Once they hit the camps, the men and the women were separated, so of course, family is lost. It was the last time he would see his mother and one of his sisters. We find out in later books, one of his other sister did survive, but he lost his mother and sister. They were taken into a separate part of the camp, so it was just his father and he. Um, and then any other sense of identity is taken away. They don't need to wear the yellow star anymore because obviously, if they weren't there, if they weren't Jews, they wouldn't be there. They're given prison uniforms basically to wear, and the final indignity, the final indication that they weren't seen as human beings anymore, were the tattoos that each one of them had to carry. Ellie's was A7713, and that's something else I always like to bring up too. Can you imagine being a survivor of the Holocaust, however many years you lived after that, and wake up every morning and see that, and it's a constant reminder of what you saw and what you went through. Life is lost. Those who can are worked to exhaustion. So any strength they might have had to maybe try to fight back or rebel, that's gone. They have to endure unspeakable horrors. And one of the questions I ask you that I'll get to maybe in another video, we'll go over some of your answers about some of the more vivid things that he describes that really stay with you. And it's a very short book, but a very powerful book, and a lot is crammed into those 150 pages or whatever it is. And sadly, and maybe most horrifically, I mean, at some point, any sense of empathy for one's fellow human beings is gone. It really does become a situation where it's my survival, and I will do anything to survive, and I don't care about any other people. And that brings up one of the other themes of the story that I think he intersperses in his narrative. And that is the story about fathers and sons. And if you remember, there are a number of situations in the story where sons turn on fathers. So at some point, any sense of family is gone. That sense of survival is so important that I will even step over my own flesh and blood to survive. And he says a couple of times, or at least once that I can remember, he says, I hope I never feel that way about my father. But he saw, that's what happens. If you're starving and there's a crust of bread there, and the person you're fighting, the crust you're fighting for happens to be a family member, it doesn't matter. All right, so any sense of empathy, care for fellow human beings. He mentions a couple of hangings that he saw and how it affected him, or the lack of emotion he felt about it. One child in particular was hanged, and he talked about that. Then eventually there is the evacuation, the death march that they went on, which claimed his father. And again, he never reached the point where he hoped that his father would die. But it is interesting that when his father does finally pass, his first thought is free at last. And I always take a little bit of time in class to talk about the meaning of that. Most people get the obvious interpretation of that. First of all, he might be talking about how his father is finally free at last of all the pain and suffering. He's now doesn't have to deal with that anymore. Usually somebody also points out that maybe Ellie's talking about himself too. I'm free at last. I don't have the responsibility of taking care of him anymore, because they were keeping each other alive for all that time. And now that his father's gone, Ellie can now really just seriously concentrate on his own survival. But the third interpretation is the one I don't think most people catch, and well, that's why they pay me the big money. free at last could also mean that Ellie is literally free at last. There is absolutely no, well, we talked about this. By this point, everything has been taken from him. There really is no reason to live anymore. The only reason he was alive, he kept alive, he stayed alive for his father. He didn't want, I mean, because there's nothing, they always say, there's nothing worse than losing a child. So he fought, and he tried to stay alive because he knew how devastating that would be to his father. But now that his father's gone, he's free of that too. So you have, in a 15-year-old kid, this moment where I really, there's nothing left for me. I'm free at last. I could die, and I could just give up now. I can give up now if I want to. And it's very fortunate for him, given that mindset, that really in a matter of days, they were liberated. Because I really don't think he would have lasted much longer. Because, once you give up all hope, I mean, what's the most important intangible of all? You can't see it, but hope is the thing that keeps us going. And if you take away all semblance of hope, then why go on? And that's where he was at that point. So he finally was liberated, April of 1945. There was just recently, well, it's coming up, the 75th anniversary of the liberation. So those are all the things that were taken from him, tangible and intangible. It's kind of the answer to that first WA question. I'm going to stop this video right now because I don't want it to get too long, because then it would take too long to download. Stay tuned for part 2, and I'm going to have my cookie, and I'll be right back with you.